was audible. The first speaker for position for porn.
Okay, please, can you come again?
For porn, you can start your speech now.
Okay, am I audible enough?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool. Do I need to open my camera?
If you want to, that's fine. That's totally up to you.
But I can just do it like this, right?
Definitely.
Okay, cool then. That's good. Then let me set myself. What did this guy set myself? And okay, I hope I'm good. And if we're all set, then I'll start my speech. I'll start my speech in 3, in 2, and then in 1. You see, chair and the members of the August House, when we just want change and when we just think that there's a lot more to do with the need of change, there's a lot more to put into that effort. When we want change for ourselves, but the person that is ahead of us can't really bring the change that we want to get today. I'm so proud to propose. This House supports mass civil disobedience as a legitimate response to perceived government outreach in developing democracies. Now, before going any further, let me just highlight the key terms that we have today. That is first, mass civil disobedience. It just looks like a form of non-violent resistance in which a large group of people deliberately and openly violate laws, orders, or commands of a government or authority to protest unjust policies, demand change, or change oppression. It just aims at drawing attention, raising awareness, and then leading to policy changes. It looks like closing of shops. It looks like rejecting or maybe buying something in the market. It looks like maybe stopping the buses from moving and stuff as that. 2, developing democracy. These are nations that are in the process of transitioning from the authoritarian or semi-authoritarian system to more democratic forms of governance. They look like countries that still have low democratic practice system and they just have a lot more to put in. Now, a few setups and framing that we have today. That is first to start with, what causes this mass civil disobedience? First, we just think there's a lot more to do with political oppression and lack of representation, where people just think that there's a lot more to do with being oppressed politically and they just lack representation. And then 2, we think that there's economic exploitation and inequality, where there's a lot more to do with unfair taxes. But then 3, we think that there's social injustice and discrimination, where there's a systemic racism that comes in with the side from the government. And then what impact does this kind of mass civil disobedience cause? First, we think the change of policies that comes with mass civil disobedience. We just think that with the fact that people will stop maybe closing the shops, people will boycott and stuff. We just think there will be change of policies because of the fact that it's a direct impact that they're putting. And then 2, we think that there's raising of awareness that comes when many particular people are on the streets protesting and saying that we do not want this or boycotting and stuff. We just think that there's a lot more that comes with raising awareness that the people of this nation do not want this particular thing, or a group of people do not want this. And then 3, it draws the attention from the government when they just fail to see the needs of the people, or when they just fail to acknowledge that there's a problem that has to be addressed. Having this massive disobedience draws the attention of this kind of people. Now, how does it contribute to this developing democracy? First, we just think it strengthens civil engagement and political participation. In an instance whereby the government doesn't have this kind of civic engagement, we just think by having this kind of mass civil disobedience, there will be a lot more with strengthening this kind of engagement and political participation from the side of the government themselves, and a lot more to be put in. And then to a point of exposing institutional weaknesses and demanding reform. We just think when the institutions are weak and not able to be exposed, there's a lot more to do with the mass civil disobedience that comes with this exposure of institutional weakness and how they can demand the reforms. How then do they reply? Then they become knowing that there's an institutional weakness somewhere and become addressed, unlike when we think that we're going to solve it in a way that wouldn't happen. We just think there's balancing of majority over the minority itself. We just think at a point of time when people have a lot of things to handle, or when people are not seen, or when the minority are not seen, there's a lot more for them to do by having this mass civil disobedience, that a lot more will be added in place, and there'll be a lot of balance of the majority rule and how they become so unstuck at the developing democracies. And then to a point of testing and expanding the democratic norms. We just think that in countries that are developing democracies, there's a lot to do with the democratic norms, and we just think that this mass civil disobedience itself becomes democracy because we think that democracy says that it's a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And if it's by the people, then we just think there's a lot more to do with this massive disobedience of these people for them to demand their rights or for them to demand what they are to have. And then to a point of what do we then say? We just think that there's a lot more to do with correcting of democratic deficits and expansion of inclusion. There's a lot more to do with inclusion here when we just think that the people of that particular place are not included, and there's a lot more that they will do for them to be included. This can only be achieved when we have the massive disobedience in these developing democracies that have a lot more to do with democracy itself and have a lot more to correct. And we have correction of the democratic systems themselves with democracies that are still in place. We're going to take an example of nations that have a lot to do with maybe the president staying in place in power. We just see that it can only be achieved when we have this massive disobedience where they just think this is not right and can be corrected. And then to avoid of strengthen civic cultures and political accountability. When we talk about political accountability here itself, in developing democracy, we just think that there's a lot more to do with political accountability when they just can't see that they're supposed to do this, or when the politicians themselves or the leaders themselves said maybe this kind of democracy since it just came into African nations or into other parts of the nation itself. We just think there's a lot more to do with them not knowing it and taking it maybe for advantage. We just think that having the massive disobedience is one of the ways that aware them of their accountability and what they haven't done in the nation. And we just think that it strengthens the civic culture themselves or the culture of the people that are in that country and need a lot of change. And then to avoid of accelerate reforms when institutions fail. We just think that developing democracies that are slow, developing democracies that are corrupt, and developing democracies that are rigid have a lot more to do with being corrected by the mass civil disobedience because of the fact that it will accelerate the kind of reforms when these institutions have totally failed. It only becomes achieved when these civilians themselves identify a problem and then kind of exhort to massive disobedience itself. And then I'll point to why we think it's more efficient than any other kind of form for change that they might bring up on their house today. First, we just think that there's speed and direct impact here. On our house today, when people go on street and protest, when people go on street and tell the government that they're boycotting, or when people want to close the shop, we just think that there'll be a speed because it becomes a direct impact and something that is seen and we require change as fast as possible. And then it creates visibility and agenda setting power. We just think that they become visibility from the side of the government when they just know that yes, the civilians are seeing us and the civilians know that this is not right and the other is right. There becomes visibility and agenda setting power. And then to Apollo, it has low cost and high level participation. When we talk of low cost, as they might come up with maybe diplomacy, as they might come up with maybe voting or legislation that require literacy and money. We just think for people who are not literate, for people who are not rich, or people that are far deep down in the state or far deep down where people cannot reach, we just the best way they can hear out what is affecting them is by the mass civil disobedience that will come with them hearing out what is their problem and how it becomes so, and the government is able to see that, and it doesn't require them to maybe use their literacy, maybe they're not literate, or it doesn't require them to use their money if they do not have the money. And then a point of things that we think would not work on the side of the day. We just think that when they say that there's violence on our house of state, then we will tell them that mass civil disobedience as stated in our speech is not anything to do with violence. It is something to do with non-violence. And then the response of the government later on will be determined of how this thing becomes handled. The government has accountability of better response to this and how it becomes so. We just think with all this, the massive disobedience becomes the best tool for change and becomes the most effective tool that we can use for change only in our house of the day. And we just think any other form of change does not really account for the change that we get from this developing democracy system. With all this, I'm so proud to propose.
We think that's speaker for a very fine speech. Let's welcome the first speaker from opposition. Yeah.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
All right, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Now, democracy, especially in developing nations, is a fragile and hardened system. It thrives not only on elections, but on the legitimacy of institutions, trust in legal norms, and public faith in gradual reform, right? Today, the proposition asks us to legitimize mass civil disobedience, not as a last resort, not in dictatorships, but in developing democracies, right? Based only on perceived government overreach, right? We on side opposition reject this. We believe that one, mass civil disobedience undermines democratic consolidation, right? Number two, it invites chaos, populism, and polarization. Number three, it incentivizes lawlessness as a political weapon, right? Instead, we support structured democratic resistance within legal frameworks. A counter model I will propose shortly, right? Now is a characterization and contextualization of this debate, right? Now, what is a developing democracy? These are countries where free and fair elections occur regularly, right? Number two, civil society is active, but institutions are still consolidating, right? Number three, courts, media, and bureaucracy exist, but they are not fully independent or robust, right? Examples include India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and Kenya. I could name many, right? These are not authoritarian regimes, right? They are imperfect democracies with working systems that can be improved, not burned down by proposition. Right now, what is mass civil disobedience? Right, this refers to large-scale organized refusal to comply with laws. Right, often via one shutdowns of roads, airports, or public services. Right, strikes by essential workers, tax refusal, curfew violations, and institutional boycotts. Right now, also occupation of government buildings or civic infrastructure. It bypasses legal institutions and often disrupts daily life, the economy, and the public order, right? Now, and crucially, the motion allows this not in a response to confirmed abuse of power, but merely a perception of overreach, right? That vagueness is exactly what makes this dangerous, right? Now, what is our counter model here? We propose a counter model, right? This house supports structures, institutionalized civic resistance, right, including legal challenges, electoral mobilization, peaceful protest within the law, and independent journalism, right, as the legitimate way to challenge perceived overreach in developing democracies. Now, why do we propose this? Because these two strengthen every institution that holds power accountable, right? Number two, it fosters civic responsibility and democratic maturity. Number three, it avoids destabilizing easily co-opted nature of mass disobedience, right? We believe that working through the system, even when flawed, is ultimately more just, legitimate, and effective, right? Now, what is the setup in the case of this debate, right? In this speech, I will show how civic disobedience undermines democratic consolidation and institutions, show how it causes instability and opens door to populism and political violence, preempt the romanticized examples of proposition may bring, right? My second speaker will come and deepen the comparative between our model and theirs, right? Show how mass civil disobedience is often co-opted and turned violent, right? And deliver the principled and pragmatic summary, right? Now is our first argument here. In developing democracies, the key to progress is institution building, right? Courts, opposition parties, electoral commissions, and media may be flawed, right? But they are the mechanisms of accountability, right? When you legitimize mass disobedience, you teach people that one, the law is not optional. The law is optional if you disagree strongly enough, right? Number two, elections don't matter if you lose, right? Number three, courts are irrelevant if you don't like the verdict, right? This delegitimizes the system itself. And once that norm spreads, it doesn't stop with the oppressed, right? It gets by religious majorities who oppose minority rights. Number two, economic elites who dislike regulation, populists who claim voter fraud whenever they lose, right? Everyone believes their cause is just, so everyone feels entitled to disobey. That destroys trust in neutral rule of law, and the entire democratic project begins to unravel. And that is why we oppose this motion this morning, proud, right? Now, what is our second argument here? Massive disobedience does not exist in a vacuum. It has real costs in developing countries, right? It disrupts economies, shutting down supply chains, hospitals, and public transport, right? It creates law and order crises, right? Police overreaction, rioting, and counter mobs, and more, right? It also leads to fatigue and backlash, right? Especially among the poor and working, right? The working class citizens who suffer the most, right? Now, when order breaks down, two things happen here. Number one, government uses this as justification to clamp down emergency laws. censorship, military deployment, and ironically increases the overreach, right? Number two, voters swing towards strongmen, right? At least they'll restore order, but at least the restore order in quotes, right, becomes a common logic, leading to authoritarian regression, not reform, right? This motion in trying to save democracy may as well kill by accident, right? Now, what do we expect proposition to come and say, right? The proposition may cite Gandhi, MLK, or Arab Spring, right? But these comparisons fall apart, right? Gandhi and MLK, right, were fighting systems that were fundamentally undemocratic, right? Colonialism and apartheid, right? The governments they oppose denied basic rights and representation. That's not the case in developing democracies, right? They might come and say that the Arab Spring proves our point, it proves their point, right? Egypt's disobedience led to military dictatorship. Tunisia was an exception, not a rule, right? They may come again and say that the perception of overreach is deeply subjective, right? One group sees progress, another sees tyranny, right? Mass disobedience makes no distinction between good faith resistance and bad faith sabotage, right? This legitimizes and opens doors for chaotic populism and counter movements, not democratic reform, right? Now, what are the impacts and comparatives of this house, right? Let's now weigh the comparative impacts, right? On democracy, prop undermines faith in institutions and encourages street power, right? Number two, preserves long-term institutional growth and accountability, right? On stability now, prop comes here and causes disruption, overreaction, and backlash. Now, we as OP come and allow targeted legal resistance with sustained pressure, right? Now, on political culture, the prop comes here and encourages zero-sum emotional mobilization, right? And OP comes here and builds habits of engagement, negotiation, and reform, right? Under our model, citizens become stakeholders in democracy. Under theirs, they become saboteurs, right? They come here and they say leads to civic engagement, right? We agree that people will come together at first for a movement, but at the end of the day, it will lead to violence, whether we like it or not. This violence would then lead to death of people. Why? Because these regimes are oppressive. Sorry, not taken, right? Because these regimes are oppressive and will be willing to remove anyone in their way, right? We need democracy that happens in a very peaceful manner, right? Civil disobedience leads to violence, which is suicidal for both the government and the people, right? So mass civil disobedience is a seductive idea, but in the context of developing democracies, it is a dangerous one, right? It corrodes institutions, deepens instability, and legitimizes lawlessness, right, based on mere perception. We are not defending government overreach. We are defending responsible democratic resistance that reforms the system without breaking it, right? Because when democracy is under strain, you do not abandon it, you strengthen it. That is why we are proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for that very fine speech. POIs are highly encouraged. Let's ask and take POIs. Let's welcome the second speaker from proposition.
Okay, am I audible enough?
Yes, you can move a little bit closer to your mic, but yeah, audible.
Yes, sorry, my I'll start shortly. Okay, if you're all set, begin speaking 3, 2, and 1. Chair and members of the Argus Team opposition tends to lose the debate in their first speech. When they actually come on board and give us a contribution of a peaceful protest and just doesn't understand what we tell them in our first speech. We just tell them in our first speech that mass civil disobedience, these are non-violent protests, ladies and gentlemen. Things to do with stopping the bus, things to do with shutting, not buying things from the market. We just think that is already a peaceful protest, not causing any violence in our house of the debate. So proud to have affirmed the resolution. A couple of things from my speech. Looking to what they're saying, what we are saying, and my content. First, what did they tell us in their first speech? They came up with and tell us that the mass civil disobedience undermines democratic legitimacy. We just don't think that this mass civil obedience this undermines democratic legitimacy simply because Here we are not doing things with that violent disobedience. We just believe that with this mass civil disobedience, we are able to solve problems simply because these things come about when the government fails to give the needs of citizens. We just have to do this mass civil disobedience with non-violent that later on once our let's come on board and tell us. It causes chaos. We just tell you in the first speech, in the definition and characterization of this mass civil disobedience, we just tell you this massive disobedience are things to do with non-violence, which means it is not causing any chaos in the society or in a particular country that will later on result of violence in that particular country. We just think that is not correct in their house of the debate. They just seem to tell us in their house of debate. What they want is perfection of power. We just believe that they agree with us in their house of debate because we are the perfect power. We just believe if a government doesn't give the citizens what they need, that is not already a perfection of power. We just believe that with this non-violence, for the citizens to work for their right, for them to advocate for their right, we just think that they are actually perfecting the power of these particular people in order to correct themselves in whatever aspect they are actually not doing good to their citizens. They give us a kind of function of these protest. We just think that is a very big loophole in their house to be. Because in their house to be, we just have this protest through mass civil disobedience. It's a disobedience that do things not to do with non-violent ladies and gentlemen. We just think that the counterculture doesn't work in our
POI, ma'am.
The legitimacy journalism. We just believe that this legitimacy journalism doesn't work in our house. If you're taking a scenario of this scenario of Jamal Khashoggi, ladies and gentlemen, this was a journalist that was killed because of a lot of problems in a particular country. We just think that if you're going to use this massive disobedience, there is nothing to do with non-violence. So with legitimacy of journalism, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of problems that we don't achieve in our house. So we are going to use this massive disobedience. We just think that there's nothing to do with legitimacy journalism. We also came on board that the law is optional. We just believe that they are actually seeing problem with their house of it, and that's why they tell us the law is optional. If we the law is optional, the government itself can decide on everything that government to the citizen of that particular country. And if the law is optional, this citizen actually will be undermined by the law. They will be worked on things that they doesn't want, things that
POI, ma'am.
and that's injustice. And that's why we actually want this mass symbolism for this citizen to advocate for this right in order to deserve citizens of that particular country. They also came on board a talk of things to do with election is meaningless. We just think that in their house of women, they tend to take election as a meaningless. We just believe that with democracy, ladies and gentlemen, you as a person have to be elected with trial, ladies and gentlemen. If I tell you are going to be corrupt in that particular aspect, we just think it's a very big loophole in their house of the because there's no way you can be given a will that is not do us, or maybe you are given things that are not to do with the election. But with this election being meaningless in their house, we just think it is a very big loophole in whatever thing they are saying. So also come about and talk of things to do with that disrupt economy. They say in our house with massive obedience, we are actually there to disrupt economy, such as stopping buses, maybe shutting down schools, shutting down hospitals. We just think
POI, ma'am.
Just think that if you want to stop buses, we are going to shut down hospitals and schools. We just want change, and the change you achieve in our house is a change that they can't ever achieve in their house. If we shut down all these communities, but we are looking actually for a better change that we later on have the consistency of this particular buses of these particular hospitals on how these people should be treated, on this school on how education should be applied on both people as citizens of that particular country. Don't come about and tell us that the Egypt civil disobedience leads to a particular political dictatorship. We just believe that if this thing actually leads to a political dictatorship, we just believe that it is not ATF a massive disobedience. Because this massive disobedience work with things to do with non-violence and gentlemen. There's no violence here. Therefore, it has led to a political dictatorship doesn't become a non-violent in our house of the debate. So also come about and talk of things to do with undermine faith in government. Look here, if we like to undermine faith in government, we used to believe that that government does not work for the rights of that particular citizen, does not work for the needs of that particular citizen, and that's why we have to undermine faith in this government, and we also work with massive disobedience in order to have this faith in this government. So if we don't undermine their faith, without doing this corruption, without not giving the needs to this citizen, we just believe that if I told we are going to work with massive disobedience, we are just bringing a strong faith in this government on how they can actually change themselves and give change to the citizens themselves in a particular country. They come about a talk of things to do with distraction. But now how to do there's distraction. We just told him in my early speech that there's no distraction here. And if I know there's distraction, it is non-violent, it is not doing anything to do with it. And if there's distraction, we are looking for a better day. And with this better day, we are able to achieve everything we want in the house of the debate, not what they want in their house of the debate. They come about a of things to do with violence. We just said in our first speech, now massive disobedience is a thing that do not collaborate with violent legislation. It is an environment movement. This to do with bus stopping. This to do with protest and this. And if there's violence movement, we just believe it is. We just don't believe it is a multiple disobedience. Now, what do we tell you in return in our house of the debate? We just tell you it corrects democratic deficit and expand inclusion. In our house of debate, there's inclusion because this massive disobedience is being carried out by a group of people. And in this group of people, we actually include the marginalized people. We include the people that live deep down in the rural area and later on come and want and advocate for their rights, of which they can be actually granted their rights. We tell you it corrects the democratic deficit with a democracy having problems such as
Great to take my POI.
Speaker, another country has problem with democracy. More leaders are actually staying in power. We're actually staying in the house with mass civil disobedience. We actually change and maybe correct this democratic deficit. What I tell you is strengthen the civic culture and political accountability. We just tell you these political leaders are actually accountable for everything they do in the system. And with mass civil disobedience, we just think that we can correct all these things when the leaders are being accountable for everything they do to the citizens themselves. We actually tell you it strengthens the civic culture. We just tell you this accelerates reform when institutions fail. We just tell you it slows down or corrupt or maybe rigid. We just tell you in a house of this with mass civil disobedience, we actually accelerate reform when institutions fail. When people actually fail to serve us for our rights, to serve us our needs, we actually go on with mass civil disobedience in order to receive our rights, receive our needs, and later on achieve them with a non-violent movement and violent project that will not bring about death of people. And with all this, I was so proud.
We thank the speaker for that very fine speech. Let's welcome the second speaker from opposition. Again, POIs are highly encouraged. Do not badger the speaker, just ask once and then wait for 30 seconds before you ask another one. And also we encourage speakers to kindly accept POIs. That's what makes the debate engage. This is a quarterfinal. Opposition
Okay.
to
Okay, sorry. Then let me get myself in order. Someone calling my name. Okay. So I shall begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and lift off. Okay, sorry for that. I shall begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and lift off. Okay, so first of all, let me go to my rebuttals, right? So Prop, right, may or may have said that, argued that this civil disobedience, right, is a last resort, right? But if citizens, right, tend to actually jump to disobedience, right, and they're actually disobeying the law and the government and stuff like that, right? So they actually jump the gun, right, without actually reaching to legal action, right, or actually trying to find a peaceful means without actually being disobedient and being good citizens, right? They didn't actually try to find a peaceful meaning, right? So what are they doing? They're jumping straight to disobedience. Why? Because they think they're justified, right? But they haven't understand the side of the government, right? And what the government is actually doing about that, right? Or even so, if they weren't happy with the government, right, they just decided to jump to disobedience first without actually trying to solve the problems peacefully, right? So this makes them no different to the government, even so they were actually being disobedient, right? So, and you're saying, and what are they saying right now inside proposition, right? They're saying, hey, let's go get ourselves killed, right? Or let's get ourselves tear gassed. Why? Because the legal action or the peaceful means doesn't effectively do it, or you're saying these peaceful means, right, don't actually do us good, and the government isn't actually hurt by these peaceful negotiations and dialogue, right? So what you're saying, okay, let's go get ourselves tear gas and stuff like that. And then you end up complaining that the government is actually a bad actor and the government is doing so and so to us, right? So secondly, if the government, right, is by the people, with the people, right, we need democracy that happens, right, in a peaceful manner. So civil disobedience, right, will eventually lead to violence, right, with or without your consent, right? Because it will eventually lead to government, and this is bad for both people and government, right? Because why? We end up harming the government. Two, we end up harming the people in the process, right? And once we harm the people in the process, the country isn't good with itself, which leads to the country actually crumbling. Because these countries, right, are actually trying to develop, right, democratically, right? So what would you do? It will in fact lead to underdevelopment in the nation, right? So let's go into my arguments, right? So first of all, right, the future implementations, right? So if we do this mass civil disobedience, right, it becomes a common response to government actions, right? People actually stop with the other peaceful ways and they actually say, okay, disobedience, let's just be disobedient, right? So this leads to a culture of disregard, right? And institutions, right? And rule of law. So you end up disobeying the law. You don't follow the law anymore because you are deciding to be disobedient because you want to solve the problem. Okay, it might work, but this is not morally and ethically proper. Because why? You are jumping the gun. You are trying to get what you want. What you're doing is you're trying to fight a person for a candy bar. That's exactly what it's like. So what does this then lead? This leads to erosion of trust, right? So citizens, right, will lose faith in the ability of institutions to address their grievances just because of problems, right? You decide to be disobedient, right? So the citizens will now lose trust and faith in their governments, right? And it will lead to further instability. Why? Because you're saying we don't have a proper government, right? So secondly, right, on the polarization, massive disobedience, right, can lead to, they can cause a conundrum, right, in existing divisions, right, making it more challenging to find common ground and resolve issues. Why? Because you are being disobedient, right? So in being unable, right, to solve these common issues, right, even so the petty issues, right, are now going to be considered what? To a larger scale, right? And are missing because why these people are being disobedient and they actually think being disobedient, right, is actually proper, right? So if these institutions are weakened, right, we can create an environment, right, where authoritarian tendencies can thrive, right? We actually manipulate the government, right? Now with this, right, we end up promoting, or we end up implementing decisions, right, that are not proper, or decisions that are actually wrong because you decided to be disobedient, right? And you want it to work for you, right? So secondly, right, moving on, right, most developing governments, right, are oppressive in their nature, right? So if we then do that, right, people are going to be killed. Why? Because of the oppressive nature, right, of these developing governments, right? They may end up, right, making their military, right, or implementing ways to stop these people, right? So we are going to have the military attacking people, right? We are going to have our youth being killed, and we lose the value of life, right? Once we have our youth being killed, right, we actually kill our country, right? Because the youth are the future, right? We end up harming future generations. We kill our people, right? And what is this going to happen, right? We're going to have sanctions being implemented on the country. Why? Because you are harming the people, you are doing so and so, and then as a government, right, you then tend to end up being like, you being what's the word? You being isolated, right? So on our end, right, we managed to protect lives, right? We managed to protect lives because we address these issues, right, in a more just, quiet, and peaceful manner because we are all looking for peace, right? Which means that even so, you are doing this in a disobedient manner, right? We cannot risk to a manner that can harm people in the process, right? Without actually trying our best do something that is peaceful. Why? Because if we still do this, we may or may not solve this problem, right? But we are still going to have people harmed on your side. So that makes us mutually exclusive. Why? Because we tend to harm less people. We don't actually harm people, right? Because we value the value of life and we think that it is important on our side, right? So moving on to my second argument, right? On an even if analysis, right? Even if the government, right, has flaws, right? Governments are not perfect, ladies and gentlemen. Let's understand that, right? So this doesn't justify mass disobedience. Why? Because this is based on misinformation, right, in political agendas. Because people, right, may have their own political agendas to manipulate the government, right? So if they tend to do mass disobedience, right? They actually manipulate us in the process, and if they succeed, right, they're succeeding only, right? So on the long-term consequences, right, we still have this erosion of trust, right, where instances of massive disobedience, right, and this can erode, right, our trust in people, right? So, and we actually tend to damage the democratic government, right? So unjustified, we have this unjustified, right, legitimization, right, of governance, right, which can undermine the democratic rule of the law in the country, right? Because we are actually choosing to be disobedient, right? So on democratic institutions, right, and the legitimacy, right, effectiveness of these institutions, right, can be compromised if massive disobedience, right, is based on information becomes common, right? Once this becomes common, right, it can actually be legitimized and manipulated, right? Which means that we are going to have manipulation in the system, right? Moving on to my third argument, right, on why we'd rather prepare for peaceful actions like dialogue and negotiation, right? We are saying that we promote a constructive engagement, right? Dialogue and negotiation, right, will allow for constructive engagement between citizens and the government, right? Then we thereby foster understanding, right, and cooperation, right, between the people and the government, right, will actually lead to a series of understanding whereby disobedience doesn't actually have that. This actually makes us mutually exclusive. Why? Because disobedience, right, will actually have more violence, more chaos in it, and the government will not actually agree with the people, even if so the people's motives are completed, right? So through dialogue and negotiating, right, parties can work together and find mutual beneficial solutions that address these grievances and promote the good in common in people, right? We actually unite people with the government. We actually have people understanding from government through this peaceful dialogue, right? So what does this then, why is this then important, right? We through dialogue and negotiation, right, we can lead to sustainable solutions, right? Solutions which actually last, solutions which don't have self-perpetuating harms, right? And solutions which don't have long-term bad effects, right? So we increase the trust between the people and the government, right? And we actually reduce conflict because dialogue and negotiation, right, can reduce conflict and promote peaceful resolutions between disputes, right? So what be comparing, right, to the CD, I'm calling this the CD, right? So more effective, right? Dialogue and negotiation, right, can be more effective in achieving lasting change, right? So what does this disobedience then does? Yes, it may change, right? But the change will not last because 15 years later, we're going to have rebels. We're going to have more groups committing this civil disobedience. Why? Because their goals were not fulfilled, right? These people were silent, right? These people fought for a change, right? Now this change, right, is going to make other people fight for another change, right? Which then cause a self-perpetuating series of harms and unpeacefulness, right? So, okay, right, we may say like the overreach, right? The overreach might not be as bad as it is. Why? Because the Western propaganda, right? So they may manipulate the situation and make it seem like it's something very, very bad, right? Because you decided to jump to disobedience, right? But in actually peaceful manner, right? We actually see, right, that this is not actually bad because we've got together and actually talked about it. So if we do it right, if we actually do this CD, right, we do not reform the democratic system. So you don't basically change the system, right? We actually create a weak system, etc., right? Because we actually lead to it being unstable because the government doesn't trust these people, the people doesn't trust these governments, right? So what does this then look? The other countries, right, will see our government as unstable or unable to control its people, right? And this leads to a conundrum, right, of a situation. Why? Because we are going to have more chaos on top of more chaos, right? Because we will be seen as an unstable government. And yes, that would be true. Why? Because the people are not happy and the government is not happy at the end. But if we resort to peaceful means of solving this, because they believe that what they are doing is just, right, without actually reaching a peaceful conclusion, right, to see if what they're doing is actually just or if it's actually universally accepted for the people. Why? Because other people may not accept it, or people from another region may not accept what you're fighting for, because what you're fighting for may be also contradicting another group, right? So this makes it not universally accepted. So anyone, right, who is not participating in this, right, are now seen as enemies, right? And what does this then do, right? This causes, right, more separation of people, right? It may look like these people who are silent, right, who are silent, right, are actually good, right, or they're actually a problem, but they're not actually trying to address their problem because they see no way forward. Right?
Speaker,
So what does it do? These people, yes,
speaker,
yes.
time up.
Okay, what does this then actually
You
do,
have
right?
used
So
way. Speaker, can you hear me?
yes,
You have used way beyond your time. I told you to keep your timer.
okay, my bad.
We thank the
Therefore,
speaker for that fine speech. We welcome the whip speaker from proposition.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, and then I would like to begin my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Well, panel members of the August, we think Team Up loses the debate from their first and even second, and they'll still lose in their third speech. Mainly because first they misquoted what mass civil disobedience look like. We tell you in our house of debate, this is something to do with no violence at all, which means that in this case, they aim at a particular thing to change a particular government. How does Team opposition actually see this kind of developing diplomacies? They see them as countries that are already good economically, politically, and all of those. But we tell you, with this kind of nature of these people, they're inconsistent with their policies. So this inconsistency at all doesn't bring the justice that best achieved by people. They come and tell us that it leads to chaos. It goes to maybe problems to do with the economy, disrupt the economy. But we tell you it is even because of this economy that people are subjected to massive disobedience. Because what causes this bad economy in the first place? We think that these are government officials that try to take matters into their own hands and did not take legal processes in actually giving rights to the people. A best example is the case that happened in Uganda, where in the Karamoja region, these people had to protest for their rights because in the presence of this dry heat and the drought, they needed things to do with iron ships. But the minister who was actually supposed to be directing those kind of places, they decided to loot the iron ship in this case. So what best solution can we give to this? You see, after that, the government saw that there's a problem in this particular region, and because of this problem, they were even subdued. These kind of ministers were arrested for the mistake they have done. You see, I've just shown you the efficiency of massive disobedience in the first place. Let's try to take whatever they're saying. They're talking about the legitimate journalism. We think that even this legitimate journalism brings risk to the lives of the journalists. The best example is Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed by the Prince of Qatar in the first place. This man tried to advocate for the rights of the people, but then what happened? He was killed in that case. So we think even in an individual basis, where legitimate journalists still exist, their lives are at high risk than even the disobedience, because we think that these massive disobedience are protected by the principles that both the civil people and both the government have to respect, and one of them is no violence. That is something we're advocating for in our house of debate. But let me tell you, even if this violence is to come about, it is for a good cause that the government is not about to visit. And even if it comes about, we think that it brings about the change. We're willing to risk the lives of 20 people rather than the lives of a whole state and a whole nation, that later the problems of corruption and the problems of no social services will last from generation to generation. In this, I've just shown you how best mass civil justice and justice is even perceived in our house of debate. Firstly, I'll go through what the team negative was saying, what we are saying, and how we will find solution. Firstly, they come out with a counter model of telling us peaceful protest, but this is something we're advocating for in our house of debate, making us even achieve what they want to achieve even more. They talk of legitimate journalism. We think that even in the presence of these legitimate journalists, such as the good countries that we are having, there's still a life and risk, and they have problems even with expression because they think that they might be killed in this case. They are not guarded by any principles. Then secondly, we tell you that even this kind of countries, speaker, these are countries that have problems with the economy. And what do they tell us? That we should strengthen the high court. Little do you know that these courts are also part of the judiciary part of the government. And this massive disobedience also comes about when this court is unable to give the right justice in the court of law to this kind of people. We think that even the people who are causing this massive that are triggering it should not be the one to solve it. But we think that with the pressure this massive disobedience gives to them, there will be even a change and drive in this case. That is basically how we win that point, and we think that we are the winners of tonight's solution. What do we think are the problems in ops case? They come with something to do with the courts of law, but we tell you that there's a push that needs the drive to change of this court, whether they're injustice, because we tell you that it is not all the government executives that are going to pay attention to this judiciary, but they'll pay attention to how the civilians react to that particular arm of the government. If I thought there's going to be a mass civil disobedience, this will all aim at a point, aim at a call to the government and say, oh, there's a problem here, we need to fix it. And we'll give you examples that will best actually achieve this kind of change in the first place. We tell you about the South African apartheid policy. We think it was best achieved when these people had a mass civil disobedience. They advocated for their rights and they said, this is what we really need as people, and we did not even resort into mass violence in that case. You see, I've just shown you how we achieve justice in our house of debate, less than what team opposition really achieves. To bring it back to what we are saying in this case. No, secondly, the second speaker comes of jumping into disobedience. Firstly, we tell you that this disobedience is triggered by a particular thing. So we don't think that they only jump into problems or disobedience like that. They are triggered by some factors that our first speaker told you, something they did not even engage with and they do not understand, making us clear winners of tonight's solution. We tell you its importance, it has a change and a first hand, it has speed and visibility. In this case, let's take what the team of is saying in this case. Let's try to make the court very strong. We have this legitimate journalism, even though the fact that these journalists may die, there will be no one to actually hold accountable for the insufficiency of this court in the first place. Let's try to take that thing. If a court case is going to be held against even a government official in that court, don't you think with the power and the drive that this government official is having will buy the person out of it? Obviously, that is something that has been seen because of the power and the influence. So that is the problem. That the best way we can react to this thing is through the mass civil disobedience. They say that it is not democracy, but we tell you this is the best exercise of democracy, because even if the rights of the own civilians are being violated in the first place, this is the best way we can inform the government that what you're giving us is what you're taking back, and we need it exactly for us to have a peaceful government. And this is what we advocate for in our house of debate. For now, what do we actually clash on tonight's solution? We clash on change. How does the change on team negative looks like? Change on team negative looks like only having this problem, maybe having the legitimate journalists that will tell you it is very problematic and you're putting these people's lives at risk. Even if they're there, they'll still be living under the shed because they think if I'm to say this or that, this kind of journalist will kill me, this kind of person will kill me. That's the best example of German Khashoggi. Then later on, the Prince of Qatar was not even held accountable because of the fear that they're having that more journalists will even be killed in the first place. So we tell you that this doesn't even work. But then we tell you that the change we achieve in this house is a change that will make sure that it lasts for generations, and it will be able to make this kind of people achieve the social services they're having. What team negative are advocating for? If I am a mother in a rural area, then the government is giving me services, but the services they're giving is not as the promise. I should sit down and see my children suffer with polio or maybe with measles, and I should not advocate alongside with other kind of mothers. This is what they're telling us. They say that we should go to court, we should go and report our issues to the legitimate journalists. But what we tell you, as you come in as mothers, you both should come together and have this kind of massive disobedience. This will bring about awareness to the people. Even the other regional bodies or the countries that govern this kind of other countries such as the United Nations or the East African Community will still hold these other countries accountable, as we tell you that accountability exists in our first speech. So we see in this case, the best thing we tell you is advocate for your rights. Even these journalists that you are having will be able to see what the problem is and even live stream it, and it will be visible to everyone, no cover up. We tell you that these government officials, if we're to use this high court, they still have the right for them to manipulate things. But if we're to use the massive disobedience, there won't be a way in which they will manipulate it, making us achieve change and democracy. Who is defining the rule of law? Team negative in this case. Because we tell you that even the rule of law governs even the government itself, and they said that the government have to be really resilient and they have to be visible and transparent to this kind of people. But then if the government is doing other things, who is supposed to take the laws into their own hands because even it's part of their right? We tell you that it is the civilians of the whole country. Secondly, the talk of faith in institutions. We think that the faith in institutions is even strengthened by our hazard debate, because if the problem that is in a particular institution is solved by this mass people, the institution will be able to safeguard those problems and make sure it doesn't happen in the next generation. We see this is a mass better way of having faith and institution rather than the courts that won't even do the exact thing that we're having. Funnel. If in the United States of America we are having the good judiciary, but then later we are still having this protest and having this massive disobedience. This still shows you in the presence of these other people, these even courts do not fulfill what they're rightly supposed to do. Just telling you, now bringing it back to the developing kind of democracy that are still struggling with this democracy. Do you think what the team negative actually brings is legitimate? Of course not. Secondly, we talk of death. Who has more death in the house or the bed? We think that it is team negative because in this case, the focus on the time, then the time that we are having is very long. Because in this case, you go and try to add, okay, like trying to make the court strengthen. What does that need? It needs loyal people. Where will you get loyal people? Yet your economy is bad, your salary is bad. How do you think that you're going to get these good people in order for them to have your court of law? We tell you that this thing will only be triggered if we're to use this massive disobedience. And we tell you that we are willing to risk 5 to 50 lives in order for us to protect a generation of maybe South Sudan, Uganda, or even Africa at large. You see here, we're willing to have a trade-off, not those ones who will die for this generation, next generation, and then the other generation, as said by the team negative, we think that they lose in that side. They think that they have pressure on their side, but we think that we have a better pressure in our side, where this kind of people, where where we think that we have much better peace, because in this case, the civilians will ensure that the government is intact, and the government will ensure that they're intact through the principles of this massive disobedience. At this point, I think we have received more than 5 ballots, making us the clear winners of tonight's resolution. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for that very fine speech. Let's welcome the whip speaker from.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
You can clearly hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, we have a house in the house that tells us democracy is actually achieved by people who tell us that violence is the key to success. Yes, the government is by the people, with the people, but it becomes problematic when we have side proposition telling us that everything we need to do is through violence, which is this civil disobedience, right? The moment we allow citizens to have civil disobedience, it becomes problematic. So for my third speech, expect me to give you the main clashes that are within this debate, the main points, the main clashes, the rebuttals, and our case revival, right? And why we deserve to win this debate. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the issue they raised on their side, saying that they will achieve democracy, right? We believe that democracy is something that is achieved on a discourse, right? Which this discourse, they should happen in a peaceful manner. The moment it becomes violent, it is no longer democracy, because democracy supports peacefulness, not violence at the end of the day. So on their side of the story, that point is actually clashed, right? And then we come where my first speaker tells you in this debate that disobedience creates fear. Just it creates fear, right? This is when people, right, they start to fear. Why? Because the government can no longer control its people, because they're allowing their people to actually be disobedient. The moment a citizen cannot be controlled by the legal laws of a nation, it means that we can no longer control those people, but we're actually going to have many civil wars at the end of the day. Why? Because the democracy that we want is no longer achieved. Remember, these are countries that have developed in democracies, right? They can easily go back and resort back to those violent ways of dealing with things, right? And also, my second speaker came with the point where he actually told you that citizens under oppressive rule, pro-democracy activists, and international observers, right? We don't deny that some groups may feel frustration, but the president of frustration doesn't justify destabilizing the entire system, right? Even if we are under pressure, panel, we feel like developing democracies need solutions that strengthen their institutions, not break them, right? At a moment in time where we tell you that these nations, right, the nations that are in developing democracies, right, these nations do not need things that are going to break them, but they need things that are going to work for them. So the moment you actually tell them that mass disobedience is something that is useful for them, it means that they're going to resort back to violence. Why? Because mass disobedience includes violence, and violence is not the key. Since we actually have something that is on the table, right? Something that we need, a peaceful nation, right? And also, we also have the point where we also told you that in our case framing, we actually proved to you that developing democracies have young system courts, police, elections, media that are still growing. Mass disobedience puts these growing policies and elections and media houses on a pressure system they cannot handle, leading to collapse or military intervention. Right? We actually stick to it that the moment these things, let's remember that their policies are still growing, they're still having democracy growth, right? So the moment we actually say mass disobedience is something that is going to be helpful, rather it's something that is going to strengthen them, it's something that is going to make them struggle at the end of the day, not something that is going to be useful for them, right? We also have we also seek to it that we win this debate, right? Because we properly told you how the stakeholders in this debate are going to be affected, right? We have accountability on our house, ladies and gentlemen, where we tell you that we are take accountable for the citizens, right? Where we tell you that peace is the key to everything, not violence is the key to the solution. Because we see side proposition telling us they achieve peace on the side of the house, they do not even achieve peace on their side of the house. Why? Because the moment they tell us that a citizen need to be violent and they cannot follow the legal law of a country, it becomes problematic panel, because those are the people that go back in the country, they start strike, they harm other citizens, other innocent citizens, which becomes problematic at the end of the day. And also we tell you that on our side of the house, we are considering both, we are taking both the minority and the majority rule, where we tell you that we have the people that are having discourse, right? Discourse that is going to happen in this democratic situation, where we actually have peaceful discussions, right? As much as they talk about last resort, ladies and gentlemen, but are we going to go to the last resort, which is going to bring more harm and more violence and more military intervention, rather than bringing a peaceful nation where we can also talk, where we can involve those soldiers, all those military, right, on a peaceful table? We talk things through, we come up with a solution. Because remember, these are developing democracies, right? They need proper things that can actually help them achieve democracy, not things that are going to lead them back to that military intervention that we do not want at the end of the day, right? And then we tell you that on our side of the house, we bring you the minority and the majority, right? Everyone is going to be included, ladies and gentlemen. Not, we are not going to disadvantage the other. No one is going to get hurt in the process. The stakeholders, which are the citizens of the country and the government at large, right? They're both going to be protected. No one is going to take advantage of the other, but then all parties are going to be protected. Where we don't find accountability and minority and majority rule on side proposition, right? Because they only consider themselves as the peacemakers, rather than yet they're not the peacemakers, but they are rather than causing harm to the nation, right? We also tell you that it leads to, we also tell us that we have better alternatives that exist, right? We actually tell you that we have cost permitted purchase civics education and elections are slower but safer methods. As much as something can be slower, ladies and gentlemen, we know that something that is good takes time, ladies and gentlemen. As much as it takes time, but it's something that is going to be worth it. Rather than we jump into a faster solution, right? The moment we jump into a faster solution, but then it is going to cause harm and we're going to lose resources. Because remember, if we actually involve ourselves in this civil mass disobedience, right? It means that we're going to have strikes that are going to harm the citizens. Who's going to take care of this citizens if they harm the government, right? So their last resort is not even justified at the end of the day. Why? Because it is something that is going to be problematic. The consequences are going to go on the government. Rather, on our side of the house, we tell you that we have civil elections that are actually slow, right? But they are safe, they protect everyone, they hear everyone, they make each other's voice heard, right? But then in this civil disobedience, right? We do not have that. So on our side of the house, we tell you that panel, we are a government that cares for the people, loves for the people, and we are willing to change the nation, right? Rather than these people that are taking us back, where we are fighting. Ladies and gentlemen, we have countries like Madagascar where they're just doing this when they're doing this civil disobedience. Where are they? They're not even growing, they're not even developing. At the end of the day, it becomes problematic. Panel, we need people that are actually aware of their current affairs, people that are seeing that this has actually caused problems. We need to resort to safer ways, not go back to the problems, because it becomes problematic when they do not see that this is something that is very problematic at the end of the day. So our side gives you safer ways to actually lead with these people, and we actually give you safer ways to solve this problem. At the end of the day, we do not want people that do not understand the other side of the house, right? And then on our side of the house, we tell you that we have the principles. We gave you a counter model. We gave you a counter model. We fully explained our point, and we told you the principles and the stakeholders and how they're going to be affected. So at the end of the day, our side of the house ranks above. Why? Because we have totally rebutted each of their points they stated in this case, right? The issue of democracy, the issue of them achieving peace on their side of the house is something that is out of this debate. Because the moment you actually involve civil disobedience, it means you're resorting to violence. Violence is not the key to success, but everything is going to be okay. With this, I rest my case.
We thank the speaker for that very fine speech. Let's welcome the reply speaker from opposition to round off opposition's case.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
All right. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. The government benches try to sell as a romantic fantasy that civil disobedience is the brave act of oppressed people against tyranny. But we're not debating authoritarian regimes, we're debating developing democracies, states with elections, legal systems, and fragile but existing institutions, right? And that is exactly why opposition wins this debate, because we recognized the real world dangers of this motion, right? Proposed a better alternative and defended why that what democracy truly needs, right? Institutional strength, not emotional chaos, right? We came here and told you that mass civil obedience is not the most plausible response, especially in developing democracies. Why did we say that, panel? We said it because it destroys any chance of that developing democracy to progress any further, as most of the population will be wiped out by the regime that they are going against, especially if it's oppressive, right? We said that we showed you how we value life on our side as our principled argument, as opposed to proposition which intends to underdevelop their nations that are trying to develop. Then, right? Even then, they did not try to even rebut this argument. At the very least, they came to lie to us and say that they are more accountable and peaceful on their side. But we say, fair and fine, show us then how you achieve this accountability and peacefulness on your side, and they don't. They failed to second their own arguments, which is why we win this debate from first, right? Now, what are our clashes in this debate? The first clash is legitimacy and the rule of law, right? Government bench came and said civil disobedience is a moral right in the face of justice, right? We said in a system where the law is being built, right, undermining it weakens democracy permanently, right? They never gave a principled mechanism for how perception justifies breaking the law. What counts as overreach, right? Who decides? They gave no safeguards against the bad faith actors or majority mobs who use this logic to attack minorities, discredit fair government, right? Now, we win this clash because we showed that legitimizing mass law breaking delegitimizes all democratic processes, right? It leads to a world where every group that disagrees with policy feels entitled to disrupt society, right? And crucially, they had no principled response to why perception should not override legal process in countries where people do not have electoral and judicial recourse, right? Second clash is stability versus chaos, right? Government bench came and claimed that mass disobedience forces accountability when other tools fail, right? But the examples from Gandhi to the Arab Spring were non-comparable, right? These were responses to non-democracies or structural disfragmentation, right? Now they ignored chaos, violence, and backlash that followed many of these movements, right? For example, Egypt's military dictatorship, India's communal riots after mass protests. Where's the engagement there? We showed that civil disobedience in developing democracies leads to police overreach, populist reaction, and loss of public sympathy, right? Then we weighed this short-term pressure versus long-term democratic decay, right? And our world is clearly better, one where protest is strong but legal and institutions are pressured, not paralyzed, right? Third clash here and last clash is comparative and counter model, right? They gave us a problem with no sustainable solution. We gave you a counter model of democratic resistance, legal challenges, civic organization, elections, journalism, peaceful protests within the system, right? They never engaged with how this model preserves legitimacy, enables targeted and accountable pressure, and prevents the erosion of public trust, right? We win this clash comparatively, right? Even if their world leads to some successful movements, ours achieves change without destroying the system along the way, and it's more revolutionary, right? Final weighing and why we win, right? We win on principle because they had no clear justification for abandoning rule of law based on subjective perception, right? We win pragmatics because we showed their model increases violence, instability, and long-term regression. And we win on comparative impacts because our alternative achieves the same ends with less harm, right? Their world may start with passion, but ours ends with democracy and development. And that's what we want at the end of the day for such a nation.
Time off.
Proud.
We thank the speaker for that very fine speech. Let's welcome the reply speaker from proposition, and let's end the contest ceremony.
Okay, I think I'm audible now. Yeah, and if we're good, I'll
Yes, you are
start my
audible.
speech. Yeah, I'll start my speech in 3, in 2, and then in 1. You see, panel, the team up loses the debate today when they think that our whole case is like we are for mass civil disobedience when everything is just set and cool from the side of the government. They also lose the debate when they go ahead and think that when they do not, and think that we are for violence in our house debate when we talk of mass civil disobedience. Even if we then buy into that idea, we just think it still doesn't give them a win. And wait, I come back to that. They also lose the debate when they do not understand the characterization of developing democracies as some kind of democracies that are at the start point of democracies and still have former paintings of the other governments that they were in before and still have a lot to do with corrections. They go ahead and lose the debate when they think that the mass civil disobedience is the cause of issues such as the economic issues, political issues, and other issues that they stated, rather than these issues that are even the ones leading to the civil mass disobedience. What kind of world do they prefer? They prefer a world whereby people dance to the tunes of these developing democracies and stay back without doing anything. They also prefer a world whereby people are tolerating the oppression, the harm, and think that it will be done, that they are slow and sure. They also prefer a world where institutions do not change and have nothing as a drive for them to change. Now, what do they bring on board here, and why doesn't it even grant them a win? They bring a counter model of saying that there will be a peaceful protest. See here, panel, when they say the word protest, first of all, and try to brand it as peaceful for us to make it buy the idea, we just think we don't buy into that idea because even protest itself is not approved by the government and still becomes civil disobedience itself because protest is not something that is approved by the government. They go ahead and tell us about legitimate journalism. As my third speaker told you that legitimate journalism itself risks the life of those individuals that are journalists themselves. But let's leave that aside. Let's go to the second point whereby we see that people are not able to buy into the idea of someone maybe advocating for them and are not so sure and nothing guarantees that everything will be set or everything will be fine in time. We just think that counter model doesn't really count and we think doesn't give them away. On the point of them saying that there's violence in a household, we just tell you that even if we just tell you that mass civil disobedience is not anything to do with violence. But even if we buy into your idea of violence, then we still tell you that it would rather be better to have violence and then have a change than maybe dancing to the tune of these developing democracies that are not bringing any change to us at all. Something that we tell you has a day. When they talk of disobedience of law here, see, they prefer a world whereby only one side of the country is obeying the law and the other side of the country is not. Why do I say this? On a point whereby they think that the civilians themselves are disobedient to the law, forgetting that even the government themselves are disobedient to the law, and that's why these civilians later on erupt or later on have this mass civil disobedience. They just want the government to be maybe disobeying the law, and then the civilians dance to the tune of the government. Something that they want in their house and they go ahead and tell us about chaos in the world of mass civil disobedience. We just tell you that this chaos comes first of all because there are already chaos in this developing democracy. Something that becomes that when we want to have mass civil disobedience, and then it becomes that. What do we tell you, or what world of the debate do we have today? We have a world of the debate. We have a world of the debate where we tell you that everything is set and free, and we do not have anything to do with we do not have anything to do with maybe the government only disobeying the law in one side and leaving the law in the other side. We give you a world where people fight for what is their right, and we give you a world that chooses to push for a better democracy in these nations. We give you a world that where in the future everyone obeys the law, not only one side obeying the law. We also give you a world where peace prevails on both sides. We give you a world whereby whereby the government is taught accountability and how they are supposed to fulfill their rights in this kind of civilians that are in the nation. What do we then tell you? We proceed and tell you that we bring a better impact on this kind of problems that are affecting this kind of civilians, and we also tell you that there are a lot that are being achieved by this kind of people because our impact is more efficient than what they provide on the one of the debate that we have today. And with all this, we're so proud to win this round. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was a beautiful round. Thank you to both teams. So we will not be giving away anymore. Just like the CAP announced, we will not be giving away because of time. So move to the main hall and then leave